Hello, my name is Madeline and I create crafting content here on YouTube. In today's video, I'm going to be taking you through a knitting tutorial for how to knit worsted weight gloves. So I've previously put out 2 glove videos. The first one shows you how to knit a fingering weight glove. I'll link that one up above. And then once I put out that video, I was asked quite a few questions on how to scale that pattern to make larger or smaller sizes. So I'll link that second video up above as well. Once I put out those 2 videos using a really light weight of yarn, fingering weight, I got quite a few questions on how to do the same pattern using a heavier weight yarn. So today I'm walking you through that same glove tutorial using worsted weight yarn. So down in the description box below, you're going to find a few things. So first, you're going to find a link to the yarn I'm using in this video. You're also going to find all the different video breakpoints. So that way, if you want to fast forward or rewind to any of the different parts of this video, you can find that all down below. You're also going to find a link to the full PDF version of the pattern. That way you can follow along with the instructions I'm giving. Also in this video, I've included a clip of how to customize the gloves to fit your hand perfectly. So what I recommend doing is starting off with the distance across your palm, and that should be the glove size that you choose. Then once you choose that selection, you can really customize the different lengths to fit your hand perfectly. Now it is trickier to get as many sizes out of worsted weight yarn because the yarn is a little bit thicker, right? So we can't really modify the sizes quite as much. So that's why there are 3 sizes in this tutorial. If you have any comments or questions along the way, feel free to leave them down below. And if you're new to my channel, don't forget that red subscribe button. That way you stay up to date on all my future videos. Let's get started. So let's start off talking a little bit about the yarn I'm using today. So all this yarn was kindly provided by Knit Picks, and this yarn is their brand new high desert yarn. So it comes in 2 different weights. The weight I'm using in this video is the worsted weight. There is also a sport weight, which I'll link to down below as well as this one. And this yarn is 100% US grown and spun yarn, and it's 100% wool. So if we look at some of the details back here, it recommends between a size US 6 and 9 knitting needle, which is a number 4 or worsted weight. We hand wash and lay it flat to dry, and it's 100% USA grown wool. So all really cool. I have 3 colorways here. They retail for $18.99 each, and again, you get a 100-gram ball. And there are 12 colors available in total. I just have 3 here to show you, but let me just show you these colorways, because of course purple is my favorite color, so I'm going to show you that one first. This one is called Lupine. Gorgeous purple. It has really nice stitch definition too. This blue is called Juniper Berry. And then we have the green here, which is called Willow. And this yarn is available exclusively on knitpicks.com, so I'm going to link to it down below. In addition to the yarn, the other materials I'm going to be using today are first 1 tapestry needle. I have 1 stitch marker. I have a few pieces of waste yarn here, 3 in total, and you just want to use a weight that's lighter than what we're actually knitting with, so this is just some leftover fingering weight yarn. 1 stitch marker, I can't remember if I said that already. And then the knitting needle I'm using is a size US 7 knitting needle. And we do knit this using magic loop. So we're knitting in the round, and here I have a longer cord. So this one is around 32 inches long. To start, we're going to cast on our stitches. So again, there are various sizes available in the pattern down below. So you're going to want to reference the size you're knitting to know how many stitches to cast on. For the size I'm knitting, I need to cast on a total of 36 stitches. So when we cast on for magic loop, all we're going to do is we're going to cast on the stitches just onto one of the 2 knitting needle points, just as we usually would. So all 36 in a row, and then we're going to divide them later on. The one thing I would note about the cast on method here too, is that I would recommend using a stretchier cast on, just because this is going to be the base of the glove, right? So you want to make sure this edge is nice and stretchy. So I would recommend something like the long tail cast on or the German twisted cast on. I do have a separate video where I show various cast on methods, so I'll be sure to link that up above if you're curious. Okay, so now I have all 36 stitches cast on. So now what I want to do is I want to grab onto all these stitches, and I'm going to slide them all onto my cord. Now once I have them on my cord, I'm going to count in from either side to the half white point. Okay, so once I've found that half white point, I'm going to stretch out the stitches so that I can see my cord there in the middle, and I want to grab onto the cord right there. Now I want to fold my knitting needle in half and pull on these stitches so that they move away from that half white point, and they slide to end up back on my knitting needles. So now I just have half my stitches on one knitting needle, half my stitches on the other knitting needle. Now when I actually arrange my work for Magic Loop, I want to have it so my knitting needle points are over here towards the right, and I like to hold my two knitting needles kind of like on a flat plane that's parallel to the table. So these two knitting needles are like on the same level. Then when I refer to my knitting needles, I refer to one as the back and one as the front, and the back one's the further away, the front one is the closest to me. So now the next thing I want to do is I want to make it so that my working yarn, or the yarn that's attached to my ball of yarn, is coming out the back knitting needle, or the one furthest away from me. So right now it's coming out the one closest to me, so I need to flip my knitting needles over. Now it's coming out the one furthest away. And the next thing I want to do is I want to make sure all these cast on bumps are down towards the table. So I'm going to slide all these cast on bumps down towards the table, all the way around, and make sure it isn't twisted at all on that inner edge. But as long as you get all your cast on bumps down, you should be good. Okay, so let's just review what we have real quick. So we have half our stitches on one knitting needle, half our stitches on the other. Our needle points are going over towards the right. Our two knitting needles are parallel to each other, and our working yarn is coming out the back knitting needle, which is the one furthest away from us. Now we're ready to begin Magic Loop. So the first thing we want to note is, are we going to knit or purl this first stitch on the front knitting needle? So if we're going to knit it, we need the working yarn, which again is the yarn attached to the ball of yarn, to be coming up in between the two knitting needles, and then I just drape it over that back knitting needle. So that's how we want that yarn set up if we're going to knit that first stitch. Now, when we work a Magic Loop round, to work one full round, we have to work across each knitting needle. So let's say we were knitting this first round. We would need to knit all the way across this front knitting needle, turn our work, and then knit all the way across that back knitting needle, and then that's one round. So this first round, we're going to be working ribbing. So we're going to knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl all the way across this front knitting needle, turn our work, and then again continue that same pattern of knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl all the way across this back knitting needle. So to first work across this front knitting needle, what I want to do is I want to take my back knitting needle, or the one with the working yarn attached to it, and I'm going to pull that knitting needle over towards the right. Now when I pull it over towards the right, I still have plenty of cord over here on the left-hand side. And basically all those back stitches are just on that cord, and I can now knit with this other knitting needle. So now I want to take this free knitting needle that I have, and I want to go into this first stitch on my front knitting needle, as if to knit, wrap my yarn around, and knit into that stitch. So that was knit one. Now we need to bring our yarn to the front. So bring our yarn in between the two knitting needles to the front, purl the next stitch. And now I'm going to continue working this ribbing of knit one, purl one, all the way across this front knitting needle. So now I'm reaching the end here. So for me, my last stitch is a purl stitch. And now I just want to drop that knitting needle that doesn't have any stitches on it. Now I'm going to turn my one knitting needle point, so again it's over towards the right, and I'm going to thread back in my second knitting needle point. So now if I look at my work again, I want to have my knitting needle points going over here towards the right. My working yarn is coming out my back knitting needle, or the one furthest away from me, and all my work is coming out the bottom of the knitting needles towards the table. So we just worked across the first half of the stitches. So now we need to work across the second half of the stitches, and then that's one round. So again, for me, I just finished with a purl one, so I need to start with a knit one over here. So because it's a knit stitch, I want my working yarn coming up in between the two knitting needles, and then I'm just going to drape it over this back knitting needle. If your first stitch is a purl stitch instead, you actually want to start with your working yarn down below, so you don't have to lift it up in between and over. You just leave it down here at the bottom or down in between the two knitting needles. That way, holding the yarn in these two positions, depending on if it's a knit or a purl, prevents you from ending up with a yarn over at the beginning of every half round. So again, I'm going to take my back knitting needle and I'm going to pull it towards the right. Now I still have plenty of cord over here on the left-hand side, and I'm going to take my new free knitting needle and I'm going to go right into that first stitch on this half and work that knit stitch. So knit one, purl one, all the way across this side. Now again, I'm about to finish this side, so when I finish it, I'm going to take my knitting needle points, again go over towards the right. I'm going to thread back in my second knitting needle point. And now again, my working yarn is coming out my back knitting needle, or the one furthest away from me. My work is coming out down towards the table, knitting needle points are over towards the right. So that was our first full round of ribbing. So now what we want to continue doing is working round after round until we reach the length specified in the pattern for this ribbing section. And when I measure the ribbing, I'm going to measure from the bottom of my work to the bottom of my knitting needle. And that's the length I measure. Now there is one question I get a lot too, and that's about ladders and how do I prevent ladders when working magic loop. So I'm lucky that I've never experienced ladders fully, but I can just show you the different details of how I work magic loop in hopes that it helps you prevent ladders. So what ladders are, if you haven't experienced them too, is essentially you can end up with bars on the one side of your work, or really on either side, where your round begins and ends. So what I do when I begin magic loop, and again, let's say I was starting this next one, so my working yarn is going to come up in between, over the top, and I'm going to pull this back knitting needle towards the right. So whenever I hold my work, I hold it so that this back knitting needle is pinched up against, or sorry, this back cord is pinched up against that front knitting needle. That prevents any large gaps from really ever forming at the beginning of the round. The next thing that I do is I pull the first stitch and the second stitch really pretty snug here, so I don't leave a lot of slack at all. I think those two things combined, see, you can see even now I'm still pinching that back cord up against the knitting needle, and I think that really helps to prevent ladders from forming. So if you're curious about ladders, that's how I try to mitigate them. But please feel free in the comments down below. If you have any advice for others on how to prevent them, please leave that down below. It'd be really helpful. So again, now I'm just going to continue working the ribbing over and over again, and then I'll come back and show you the next step. So I've now finished that bottom ribbing portion of my glove. So the next step is to knit 2 full rounds. So here again, we're just going to work magic loop as we normally would, and we're knitting these rounds, so we want the working yarn coming up in between and then back over the top of that top knitting needle. And I'm just going to knit 2 full rounds. And again, a full round is when you knit all the way across the front knitting needle, turn your work, and knit all the way across the back knitting needle. And if you do find it helpful as well, you could add a stitch marker to mark the front, so the one side of your work, so then you know when you're on the stitch marker, that's the first half, when you're not, that's the back half. The way I remember is I remember by looking at where my tail is, or where my cast on tail is. So whenever my tail is down here in the bottom right hand corner, this side of my work that's facing me is the first half, or the front. Then the second half, when my tail's over here in the left-hand corner, that's the back half of my work. So that's how I keep track. But again, I'm gonna knit 2 full rounds. So now that I've finished those 2 setup rounds, next up I have to do some increase setup rounds. So for these rounds, how it's gonna work is first I'm gonna work a make one right at the beginning of the round. Then I'm gonna knit 1 full round. So I'm gonna make one right, knit across my front knitting needle, turn my work, and knit across my back knitting needle. So to work and make one right at the beginning of the round, when working magic loop can be a little bit tricky just because we're working with this bar that's in between the back knitting needle and the front knitting needle. So the way I like to do this is first I'm just going to place my yarn as if I'm going to knit the first stitch. Now I'm going to pull my back knitting needle towards the right. And now there are 2 ways to pick up this bar. So the first one is you can slide your left knitting needle point so that there's just a little bit there. Then you want to go into this bar between the stitch you just worked, which is going to be this last stitch on the back knitting needle, and the one you're about to work, which is going to be the first stitch on your front knitting needle. So this topmost bar right here, you want to go into that from the inside of your work to the outside of your work. So kind of like from the back to the front underneath that loop. Then you want to knit into the front of that loop. And that is a make one right. Now, if you don't want to do that method of sliding the stitches all the way to the front there, what you can also do is you can use this right knitting needle point to help you. So to pick up this bar, I'm just going to take my right knitting needle point, going from the outside of my work to the inside of my work, pick it up, and then just place that right on to my other knitting needle. So essentially I'm making my left knitting needle point go from the back or the inside of my work to the outside of my work underneath that bar. So that's two ways to pick up that bar, to do a make one right. And again, just knit into that loop. Now I'm going to knit all the way around this round, so across the front knitting needle and the back knitting needle. Then I'm going to knit one full round after that again. Now I've just worked that first increase round where I made one right, knit across the back, and then after that I worked the full knitting round. So now I'm going to repeat those two rounds one more time. So this time, again, I'm going to work a make one right. I'm going to knit one, and now I'm going to place my stitch marker. Now I'm going to continue knitting all the way across this round, and then knit one more round after that, and then we'll be all ready for those thumb repeats. So now I'm all ready to begin the thumb increases. So this thumb increase row is really similar to the previous increase rows we've been working. So what we're going to do is we're going to make one right, then we're going to knit to just before the stitch marker, then we're going to work a make one left, we're going to pass the stitch marker, we're going to knit across the rest of the round, so knit each side, then after each increase round, we're going to knit two full rounds. And that's the increase round. So we're going to repeat those three increase rows over and over again until we have a total of the number of stitches specified in the pattern for your size. So for me, I'm going to continue repeating those over and over again until I have a total of 12 stitches before my stitch marker. So to show this first row one time, again, my first stitch is a make one right. Now I'm going to knit until the stitch marker, and now I'm going to make one left. So make one left is just the opposite of the make one right. So I want to go into this topmost bar between the stitch I just worked and the one I'm about to work, so this top bar right here, and I want to go into it from front to back, and then I want to knit into the back of that loop. So that's a make one left. Now I'm going to pass my stitch marker, and I'm going to knit all the way across the rest of this round, so both knitting needles. And then after that, I'm going to knit two full rounds. And those are my three thumb increase row repeats. And I'm going to continue those for the number specified in the pattern. Now the next step is going to be to place these thumb stitches onto some waste yarn. So over here, I have my tapestry needle. And again, it's threaded with a piece of waste yarn. And what I want to do is I just want to follow along each one of these stitches, putting in the tapestry needle, going from right to left, and just slide each one of these stitches off my knitting needle and onto the tapestry needle, and eventually the waste yarn. We put them on the waste yarn here, and then I just like to tie a little bow with the waste yarn and then tuck it inside the glove to keep it out of the way. Now I'm going to remove the stitch marker because I don't need that anymore. And now all I need to do is rejoin in the round. So I'm just going to take my back knitting needle, pull it towards the right, and then just begin knitting into this new first stitch on the front side and go right across this round. And that's all we have to do to place those thumb stitches on the waste yarn. And the last step we'll do is we'll come back and pick up those stitches and knit the thumb. But for now, I'm going to continue knitting the rest of this palm portion of the glove. So going up from where we took out the thumb increases, going up through this portion. And what I want to do is I want to measure, and the length is given in the pattern, from the top of the ribbing up to the bottom of the knitting needle. And that's the measurement I'm looking for. So for my size, it's 4 inches. So when this measurement is 4 inches, I'll come back and show you the next step. So now I've continued working all the way up through the palm of my glove, and now I'm ready to divide my work to begin working the fingers. So the materials I have here are, first I have 2 pieces of waste yarn, each are about 12 inches long, and then I have 1 tapestry needle. So to start this round, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pass the first 5 stitches on my front knitting needle. Again, the number of stitches will depend on your size, but for the size of knitting, it'll be the first 5 stitches. I just want to pass it from one knitting needle to the other. So I'm going to take my back knitting needle, pull it towards the right, as if I were going to start knitting across here. And I'm just going to slip the first 5 stitches from my left to right knitting needle. And when I go into each one of these stitches, I'm just going in from right to left and making sure not to twist these. Okay, there's my first 5 stitches. Next up, I'm going to take my tapestry needle and a piece of my waste yarn. I'm going to thread my tapestry needle. And now I want to slide the rest of the stitches on this half onto my waste yarn. So again, I'm just going to put my tapestry needle into each one of these stitches, going from right to left, and just slide each one of these stitches onto the waste yarn. Okay, so on that side of my work, I have the first few stitches on my 1 knitting needle, the rest of the stitches on my waste yarn. Now I'm going to turn my work. Now when I turn my work, I'm going to re-thread in my second knitting needle here. So now I still have that 1 knitting needle going through the 5 stitches, and my second knitting needle now has all the back stitches on here. And now, again, I'm going to re-thread my tapestry needle with the second piece of waste yarn. And now I'm going to begin going across this half, and I'm going to slip all the stitches except the final 5 onto my waste yarn. So I'm just going to slide each one of these stitches, stopping when I get to the last 5. Okay, now I have that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull my back knitting needle towards the right, and now I'm going to go across these 5 stitches, and I'm going to slide each one of these from my left to right knitting needle. Now again, I'm going to turn my work so my thumb is over here towards the right, and I'm going to thread back in both of my knitting needles to get ready for magic loop again. So now that I'm all set up here, I have both my knitting needle points pointed over towards the right. I have my thumb over here on the right hand side as well. And I have my working yarn coming out my back knitting needle. So now what I want to do is I want to begin working just these set of stitches over and over again. And that's how we're going to work the index finger. But there is one trick, and that's that we need to cast on a few stitches over here on this left edge. So I'm going to take you through this first round and show you how to work it. So first I'm going to pull my back knitting needle towards the right and knit across these first 5 stitches on the front knitting needle, or however many stitches you have for the size you're working. Now I want to cast on 2 stitches. So the way I'm going to cast on 2 stitches is I'm going to lay my hand behind my working yarn. So kind of like I'm going to put my hand further away from myself and then drag it towards the yarn. I'm going to grab onto it with my bottom 3 fingers. And now you can see my pointer finger is kind of below that strand. So I'm going to take my pointer finger, go below that strand towards myself, then up over the top to the back again, down below, towards myself, up to the top. Now I want to take my right knitting needle point and go underneath that loop that's around my finger, slide it off my finger and onto the knitting needle. So there's 1 stitch cast on. So to show that one more time, I'm going to put my hand behind that strand of yarn. I'm going to grab that strand of yarn with my bottom 3 fingers. I'm going to take my pointer finger, go down below towards myself, up over the top to the back, down below to the bottom again, towards myself up to the top. Now I'm going to take the knitting needle, go underneath that loop, drag it off my finger and onto the knitting needle. And when you tighten these on, you just want to gently tighten them on. Don't pull these too tight or else they'll be incredibly hard to knit. Okay, so those were the 2 stitches we had to cast on. Now I'm going to turn my work and I'm going to re-thread in my second knitting needle here. And now I need to work across these back 5 stitches. So again, just a regular magic loop here. I'm going to pull my back knitting needle towards the right, knit across these back 5 stitches. Okay, so that is the first index finger round. Now when I continue working round after round, I don't have to do anything special here. I'm just going to knit across my front stitches, which in this case is 7, turn my work and knit across my back stitches. And I'm going to continue knitting round after round over and over again until the total length reaches what's specified in the pattern. Or if you want to as well, you can always slide your glove over to the cord portion of your knitting needles and try it on. I find that's really helpful as well. Then we're just going to have a few cast off rows at the end. So I'll come back and show you those cast off rows once I've gotten there. So now I've finished working all the way up through that index finger and I'm ready for the decreases. So the way the decreases work is I'm going to work a 4-stitch repeat. So first I'm going to work a knit 2 together. So that's where I take my right needle point into the first 2 stitches on my left knitting needle at the same time as if to knit. So again, I'm going through both of those stitches, wrap my yarn around and pull through. Now I'm going to knit 2. And now I'm going to repeat that same thing again. So I'm going to work a knit 2 together, then knit 2 stitches. So knit 1, I'll have to turn my work in this case to finish this repeat on the other half of the round. So now on this side of my work, I'm going to finish that repeat. So I need to knit 1 more, then work the repeat 1 last time here. So knit 2 together, knit 1, knit 2. Okay, so that was my first decrease row. Now what I want to do is I want to knit 1 full round. And now for this final decrease round, I'm going to work a knit 2 together every set of 2 stitches. So I'm going to knit the first 2 stitches together, knit the next 2 stitches together. And if you end up in a situation like this next stitch where there's just 1 and I need a second stitch, all you want to do is just pull this knitting needle or the left knitting needle through that stitch and it'll end up on the other side. So now I can turn my work and keep on working my knit 2 togethers on this side. Now for some of the fingers, you will end up with 1 extra stitch there. And in that case, just knit the final stitch. Next up, I'm going to cut my yarn and I'm just going to leave about an 8-inch tail here. If you aren't sure about the finger sizing yet, so you aren't sure if you're going to want to lengthen or shorten it, I would recommend leaving some extra yarn before you cut it, just so that way you can adjust it easier without having to reattach your yarn. But in my case, I'm pretty sure on that size, so I'm going to cut it. And now I want to take my tapestry needle, thread it through the tail. And now I want to go through each one of these stitches that remains on my knitting needle. So I'm going to start with the first stitch that I would have worked on this front knitting needle. Go from right to left across the front knitting needle, turn my work, and then go through again from right to left on the back knitting needle. Now I can slide my knitting needles out and pull this tight. Now at the end, we'll weave in this end to the inside of the glove. So next up, we're going to be working the center finger. And the way we're going to do this is first, we're going to go across this first piece of waste yarn and pick up however many stitches are noted for your size in the pattern. Then we're going to turn our work and pick up the same number of stitches along this back piece of waste yarn. So to start, I want my glove down on the table with the thumb over towards the right. And I'm just going to take one of my knitting needle points and I'm going to follow along the waste yarn. And for my size, it's 4 stitches. So I'm going to pick up 4 stitches. So there's my first 4. Now what I want to do is I want to take that knitting needle point and I'm going to pull it over towards the left so that these stitches end up on my opposite knitting needle. I'm going to turn my work. So now my thumb is over here on the left. And now over here, I'm going to pick up these final 4 stitches. So this last stitch is always a little tricky to see and you just kind of have to tug on the waste yarn before it pops out. But I'm going to start over here at the right and pick up 4 stitches going from right to left. Now I'm going to slide the waste yarn out of those stitches and just be careful not to pull the waste yarn out of the stitches you still want on the waste yarn. Okay, so these are going to be the stitches I'm working with for this finger. So how we're going to work it is first we're going to knit across this front knitting needle. Then we're going to cast on 2 stitches the same way we did for the previous finger. We're going to turn our work. We're going to knit across the stitches on the back knitting needle. And then we're going to pick up 2 stitches from this previous finger. So to start, the first thing we want to do is we want to rejoin our yarn. So the way I do that is I'm just going to take about 8 inches and I'm just going to thread it to the inside of my glove. Then I just lay it over my back knitting needle. Now I'm just going to start this round as I regularly would. So I'm going to take my back knitting needle point, pull it towards the right, and knit right across these first stitches using that yarn we just rejoined. And that first stitch can be a little loose, but don't worry about it because we'll tighten it up when we weave in the ends. Now that I've gone across those stitches, I need to cast on 2 stitches. So again, we're casting on the same way we did for the previous finger. So I have my working yarn. I'm going to put my hand behind it, grab this strand with my bottom 3 fingers. Now I'm going to loop my finger underneath the strand towards myself, up over the strand to the back, down below to myself, up over the top to the back. Now I'm going to take my knitting needle point, go underneath that loop, slide it off my finger onto the knitting needle. Now again, I'm going to move my finger in that exact same direction, so down below towards myself, up over the top to the back, down below to the bottom, up over the top to the back. So I have the 1.5 loops, slide the loop off my finger and onto the knitting needle. There are my 2 stitches. So now I want to turn my work and I'm going to re-thread in my knitting needle. So I have half the stitches on each knitting needle here. Or really I have 2 more on my previous knitting needle because I just cast those on. Now I'm going to knit across this side. I'm going to pull my back knitting needle towards the right, knit across. And now this next step where we pick up 2 stitches from this previous finger is probably the hardest part. So let me zoom in a little bit. Now next up is the trickiest part. And this is where we want to pick up 2 stitches from the edge of the previous finger. So if I look at the edge of this previous finger, I can see that there are a couple different loops down there at the bottom. So the ones that I'm looking for to pick up are going to be these bottommost loops down here at the bottom. So here's one loop, and then right next to it is the other loop. So those are going to be the 2 loops that I want to pick up. Now what I found is that if I just pick up and knit into each one of those loops, I do end up with some holes that form on the front and the back side right there. So what I like to do instead of just picking up those loops is first I'm going to pick up the first loop and I'm going to pick up half of a stitch on this side over here, knit those 2 together for the first stitch. Then I'm going to pick up the second loop and half of a stitch on this other side, knit those 2 together for my second stitch. And that's what I found helps prevent holes in between the fingers. So to start with this first loop here, what I'm going to be looking for is, first I want to pick up the first loop here. So again, the one closest to me down here at the bottom. And I want to pick up this loop going from inside the glove up towards the finger. Then I want to pick up one of the stitches over here, or really half of one of the stitches. So I look for the topmost bar in between the stitch I just worked and the one I'm about to work, this bar right here, and I see what stitch that's going through. So again, I'm going to take my knitting needle and I'm going to go through that stitch going from the inside of my work to the outside of my work. So those are the two ones I'm going to work together, and now I'm going to knit those two together through the back loop. So to show that one more time, when I pick up these stitches, first I'm going to start off using my free knitting needle point, and I'm going to go underneath that first bottommost loop on the side. Then I'm going to look where the bar connects the stitch I just worked and the one I'm about to work, and I want to go from the inside of my work to the outside of my work underneath half of that stitch. Now I'm just going to knit those two together through the back. Now next up, I want to pick up that next bottommost bar. So when I pick up this one, instead of going from the inside of my work to the outside, I'm going to go from the outside of my work to the inside. So here I'm going to basically be going like down the pointer finger to the opening of the glove, pick up that bottommost bar, and then I want to look for the bar that connects basically the work that's on my cord over here in the back to where I'm about to knit into. So there's the topmost bar. So I'm going to pick up half of that stitch that's connected to that topmost bar. Again, going from the outside of my work to the inside of my work. And now instead of knitting those two through the back loop, I'm going to knit those two through the front. So just a regular knit two together. So to show that side one more time, again, I'm going to pick up that bottommost loop going down the pointer finger. Then I'm going to pick up half the loop on the other side, going from the outside, or like where all the knitting is, towards the inside, or the inside of the glove. And then I'm just going to knit those two together, doing a regular knit two together. So that's how you pick up the two stitches, and this is something you're going to have to use on the middle finger, the ring finger, and the pinky finger. So now that I've cast on those two stitches at the end of the front knitting needle and picked up the two stitches at the end of the back knitting needle, I'm all ready to begin working round after round of plain knitting all the way up through this center finger. Then I'm going to work the same decreases I did for the previous finger. So again, for the ring finger, we're going to do the exact same thing. So first, we're going to pick up stitches from this front half of the stitches, turn our work, pick up stitches from the back half of our knitting. Then we're going to work across the front knitting needle, cast on stitches, turn our work, knit across the back knitting needle, and pick up two stitches from this center finger. Then we just continue knitting up that finger. Then lastly, the only thing that's different with the pinky is we don't need to cast on any stitches on the side. So for the pinky, we're just going to pick up these remaining stitches across the front, turn our work, pick up the remaining stitches across the back, then pick up two stitches from the previous finger. Then we're all ready to begin working round after round, and again work the same decreases as we did previously. So that's all there is to working these different fingers. Then once I'm all done working the fingers, I'm going to come back and show you the thumb. Now the last thing we have to do here is work the thumb. So the way I'm going to pick up these thumb stitches is I'm going to place my glove down on the table with the thumb over here towards the left-hand side. Next, I'm just going to untie the little bow I have in my waist yarn. And starting over here from the right to the left, I'm going to take one of my knitting needles and I'm going to pick up these first half of the stitches here. So there I have 6 stitches on that knitting needle. Now I'm going to take the knitting needle and I'm going to pull it over here towards the left until these stitches end up on the other knitting needle. Now I'm going to turn my work so the thumb is now over here on the right hand side. And now again, going from right to left, I'm going to pick up the next set of the stitches. Now I can take out my waste yarn. And now I'm all ready to work the thumb. So when I work the thumb using Magic Loop, again, I set it down so the thumb is over here on the left, and that way my 2 knitting needle points are pointed over towards the right. So now what I want to do is I'm going to rejoin my yarn. So again, I'm just going to take about 8 inches, thread that to the inside of the thumb. Now I'm going to knit across these first half of the stitches, turn my work, knit across the second half of the stitches. Then, before I turn my work again, I want to pick up 2 stitches from this inner edge. So first, I'm going to knit across the front and knit across the back, and then I'll show you how to pick up those stitches. So now I just finished knitting across, so before I turn my work to begin the next round, what I need to do is I need to pick up 2 stitches from this side edge to knit. So this isn't like the other fingers where over here I have those 2 cast on stitches. So we essentially just need to make 2 stitches to cast on. So the 2 I'm going to pick up are, again, if I look for that top bar connecting the stitch I just worked to the one kind of like on this other edge, so see that top bar there? See this loop right here? That's the first one I like to pick up. And then on the other side, I like to pick up that same corresponding half loop on that side. Okay, so now I've picked up and knit those 2 stitches, and if there's any hole that remains after I begin working the thumb and continue on, what you can always do is you can take the tail that you just cast on with, so that 8 inches that you tucked inside the glove, and you can use that and a tapestry needle to help secure up that corner. So now I can turn my work, and now I'm ready to continue working all the way up the thumb. So here again, the length is going to be specified in the pattern. And then when I get to the top, I'm just going to work the same decreases that I did for the rest of the fingers. The last thing I wanted to talk about in this video is how you can modify these glove patterns to fit you perfectly. So there definitely isn't any one-size-fits-all pattern that I can create that'll perfectly fit everyone's hand. So what I would recommend doing is choosing your pattern size based off of the distance across your palm. So measure across your palm, and then you want to pick the pattern size that closest matches that distance across. So that'll give you a really good starting point when deciding how many stitches to cast on for the ribbing and then working all the way up through this portion. The next area I would modify of the glove is the distance between the top of your wrist, so kind of like the base of your hand, and where your fingers begin. So that would be this distance in here within the glove pattern. So this is another one that's easy to modify, because if you need a shorter distance, you just knit fewer rows after you put the thumb stitches on waste yarn. If you need a longer distance, you just knit more rows after you put the thumb stitches on waste yarn. The last thing that you can modify is the finger length. So one easy thing you can do is as you're knitting the glove, you can try it on to make sure the finger length is perfect for your hand. Or if you have a pair of gloves that fit you really well, you can measure the finger length of those gloves and use that as a baseline. So I hope that helps you modify this pattern to fit whatever your specific needs are. I hope you've enjoyed the video today and enjoyed learning how to make worsted weight gloves. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them down below. And if you're new to my channel, don't forget that red subscribe button, that way you stay up to date on all my future videos. I'll see you next time.